fire and placing himself over against her, and the bottle and the glass on the floor between them roared out loud, again very loud. "Well, my Slider." "I hear," said Peg, receiving him very graciously. "I've come according to promise," roared Squeers. "So they used to say in that part of the country I come from," observed Peg complacently. "But I think oil's better." "Better than what?" roared Squeers, adding some rather strong language in an undertone. "No," said Peg. "Of course not." "I never saw such a monster as you are," muttered Squeers, looking as amiable as he possibly could the while, for Peg's eye was upon him, and she was chuckling fearfully as though in delight at having made a choice repartee. "Do you see this? This is a bottle." "I see it," answered Peg. "Well, and do you see this?" bawled Squeers. "This is a glass." Peg saw that too. "See here, then," said Squeers, accompanying his remark with an appropriate action. "I fill the glass from the bottle, and I say, 'Your health, Slider,' and empty it, and then I rinse it genteelly with a little drop, which I'm forced to throw into the fire. Hallo! We shall have the chimbley all light next. Fill it again, and hand it over to you." "Your health," said Peg. "She understands that anyways," muttered Squeers, watching Mrs. Slider skew as she dispatched her portion, and choked and gasped in a most awful manner after doing. "Now then, let's have a talk. How's the rheumatics?" Mrs. Sliderskew, with much blinking and chuckling, and looks with expressive of her strong admiration of Mr. Squeers, his person, manners, and conversation, replied that the rheumatics were better. "What's the reason?" said Mr. Squeers, deriving fresh facetiousness from the bottle. "What's the reason of rheumatics? What do they mean? What do people have 'em for, eh?" Mrs. Sliderskew didn't know, but suggested that it was possibly because they couldn't help it. "Muscles, rheumatics, whooping cough, fevers, agues, lumbagoes," said Mr. Squeers. "It's all philosophy together, that's what it is. The heavenly bodies is philosophy, and the earthly bodies is philosophy. If there's a screw loose in a heavenly body, that's philosophy. And if there's a screw loose in an earthly body, that's philosophy too. Or it may be that sometimes there's a little metaphysics in it, but that's not often. Philosophy's the chap for me. If a parent asks a question in the classical, commercial, or mathematical line, says I gravely, 'Why, sir, in the first place, are you a philosopher?' 'No, Mr. Squeers,' he says, 'I ain't.' 'Then, sir,' says I, 'I'm sorry for you, for I shan't be able to explain it.' Naturally, the parent goes away and wishes he was a philosopher, and equally naturally thinks I'm one." Saying this, and a great deal more with tipsy profundity and a serio-comic air, and keeping his eye all the time on Mrs. Sliderskew, who was unable to hear one word, Mr. Squeers concluded by helping himself and passing the bottle, to which Peg did becoming reverence. "That's the time o' day," said Mr. Squeers. "You look 20 pound 10 better than you did." Again Mrs. Sliderskew chuckled, but modesty forbade her assenting verbally to the compliment. 20 pound 10 better," repeated Mr. Squeers, "than you did that day when I first introduced myself, don't you know?" "Aw," said Peg, shaking her head, "but you frightened me that day." "Did I?" said Squeers. "Well, it was a rather startling thing for a stranger to come and recommend himself by saying that he knew all about you, and what your name was, and why you were living so quiet here, and what you had boned, and who you boned it from, wasn't it?" Peg nodded her head in strong assent. "But I know everything that happens in that way, you see," continued Mr. Squeers. "Nothing takes place of that kind that I ain't up to entirely. I'm a sort of a lawyer, Slider, of a first-rate standing, and understanding too. I'm the intimate friend and confidential adviser of pretty nigh every man, woman, and child that gets themselves into difficulties by being too nimble with their fingers. I'm Mr. Square's catalogue of his own merits and accomplishments, which was partly the result of a concerted plan between himself and Ralph Nickleby, and flowed in part from the black bottle, was here interrupted by Mrs. Sliderskew. "Ha, ha, 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 ha!" she cried, folding her arms and wagging her head. "And so he wasn't married after all, was he? Not married after all?" "No," replied Squeers, "that he wasn't." "And the young lover come and carried off the bride, eh?" said Peg. "From under his nose," replied Squeers. "And I'm told the young chap cut up rough besides, and broke the windows, and forced him to swaller his wedding favour, which nearly choked him." "Tell me all about it again," cried Peg, with the malicious relish of her old master's defeat, which made her natural hideousness something quite fearful. "Let's hear it all again, beginning at the beginning now, as if you never told me. Let's have it every word, now, beginning at the very first, when he went to the house that morning." Mr. Squeers, plying Mrs. Sliderskew freely with the liquor, and sustaining himself under the exertion of speaking so loud by frequent applications to it himself, complied with this request by describing the discomfiture of Arthur Gride, with such improvements on the truth as happened to occur to him, and the ingenious invention and application of which had been very instrumental in recommending him to her notice in the beginning of their acquaintance. Mrs. Sliderskew was in ecstasy of delight, rolling her head about, drawing up her skinny shoulders, and wrinkling her cadaverous face into so many and such complicated forms of ugliness as awakened the unbounded astonishment and disgust of even Mr. Squeers. "He's a treacherous old goat," said Peg, "and cozened me with cunning tricks and lying promises, but never mind. I'm even with him. "More than ever, Slider," returned Squeers. "You'd have been even with him even if he'd got married, but with the disappointment besides, you're a long way ahead, out of sight, Slider, quite out of sight. And that reminds me," he added, handing her the glass, "if you want me to give you my opinion of them deeds, and tell you what you better keep and what you better burn, why, now's your time, Slider." "There ain't no hurry for that," said Peg, with several knowing looks and winks. "Oh, very well," observed Squeers. "It don't matter to me. You ask me, I shouldn't charge you nothing, being a friend. You're the best judge, of course, but you're a bold woman, Slider." "How do you mean bold?" said Peg. "Why, I mean that if it was me, I wouldn't keep papers as might hang me, litterin' about when they might be turned into money, them as wasn't useful made away with, and them that was, laid by somewheres safe, that's all," returned Squeers. "But everybody's the best judge of their own affairs. All I say is, Slider, I wouldn't do it." "Come," said Peg, "then you shall see him." "I don't want to see him," replied Squeers, affecting to be out of humour. "Don't talk as if it was a treat. Show him to somebody else, and take their advice." Mr. Squeers would very likely have carried about the farce, being offended a little longer, if Mrs. Sliderskew, in her anxiety to restore herself to her former high position in his good graces, had not become so extremely affectionate that he stood at some risk of being smothered by her caresses, repressing with as good a grace as possible these little familiarities, for which there is reason to believe the black bottle was at least as much to blame as any constitutional infirmity on the part of Miss Sliderskew. He protested that he had only been joking, and, in proof of his unimpaired good humour, that he was ready to examine the deeds at once, if, by doing so, he could afford any satisfaction or relief of mind to his fair friend. "And now you're up, my Slider," bawled Squeers, as she rose to fetch them. "Bolt the door." Peg trotted to the door, and after fumbling at the bolt, crept to the other end of the room, and from beneath the coals which filled the bottom of the cupboard drew forth a small deal box. Having placed this at the floor at Squeer's feet, she brought from under the pillow of her bed a small key with which she signed to the gentleman to open it. Mr. Squeers, who had